Welcome to another edition of the Long Gospel Devotional. My name is Eric Sorensen, and each week we gather to look at God's two words from all of the Scriptures. Sometimes we look at passages from the upcoming Sunday's lectionary texts. Other times we look through a book of the Bible. This week we're back looking at the first letter of Paul's to the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians, and we're in chapter 9 this week. And this chapter, for me anyway, has been pretty significant in my life. Many of you know who watch these videos that I was a church planter for a number of years, and one of the passages that really kind of inspired my desire to plant a church and to do more evangelistic work is found in this chapter, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So let's go ahead and dive into what that passage has to say to us, because I think there is much that applies not just to people that are pastors or church planners, but to, in fact, every Christian who reads this word. So what does it say to us? Well, really, the whole thrust of the passage is about Paul's desire to win people to the faith. That's the language he uses there, that he might win people or win some to the faith. And when I read him saying that he does everything he does that he might win some, I can't help but think of an oft-used phrase that we hear all the time, and that is something to the effect of, if it saves just one life, then whatever sacrifice we're being asked to do is worth it. Now, I think in many cases that phrase is used very manipulatively and is used to sort of guilt people into doing things that they may not feel comfortable doing. But there is instances in our lives in which we see this way of thinking play out. Some of you who maybe are around my age can remember the time that a baby famously named baby Jessica, or baby, I think maybe it was Jessie, I'm not sure, but got stuck down a well. And I'm not even sure about how that exactly happened or what the details were that got her stuck down a well, but nevertheless she was. And it was a massive story. It was on every news station, and it was live coverage on, at that time, I think there wasn't many cable stations to speak of, but of the television that existed, it was, everywhere. And it took quite a long time, and fire departments from all over the country came out, and military got involved, and everybody's eyes in America were sort of glued to the television to see if they were going to be able to rescue this little girl out of the well. And of course, the good news is they did. And so in that case, it made sense if somebody had said in an interview after that, it's all worth it because it saved just one life. And, the Apostle Paul sort of takes that tack when it comes to reaching those outside of the faith, or those that he'll refer to in other passages as the lost. He is going to detail in this chapter why it takes hard work and sacrifice in order for those in the church to reach the lost, to reach those outside of the faith, that it's not something that just comes automatically, that there is, in fact, a lot of hard work and sacrifice done by those in the church in order to make that happen. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, he's going to point out that there's probably going to be a sacrifice of money for the lost. And no, it's not like Mr. Beast giving away money, but nevertheless, it's going to involve money being used, because mission always costs money. Now, if you go down to verse 13 of chapter 9 in 1 Corinthians, you're going to see the Apostle Paul say these words: "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple?" He's referencing the Old Testament practice. "And those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings. In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." So Paul is stating, it seems, a very early rule of thumb in the church, that those who serve as pastors, like the Levites served in the temple, should be able to make a living off of their calling serving as pastors. And yet, Paul is going to tell us in this chapter and in other places that he has chosen not to make use of this right for the sake of the mission. And his thinking there is that he doesn't want his taking a salary to be used as a hindrance to hearing what he has to say. And so he has opted out. He has instead chosen to be a tent maker and to do work with his hands instead of just receive a salary from the church. Now, I want to point out this is not obligatory. This is not something that every pastor should do, but it is something that he did because he was willing to sacrifice finances in order for the mission to continue. Now, what's the principle for us? Well, we inevitably, if we are going to seek to reach the lost, whether here in the States or all over the world, are going to have to realize that it will cost something, that there will be a financial cost to it. Again, as a man who planted a church in one of the most expensive cities in the world, in New York City, I know this very well. I had to raise a lot of support from outside sources in order to make that project continue. And that will always be the case. There will always be money involved that helps to fund mission. And there will always be people in God's church that have those resources in order to fund God's church. And it is an investment that is worth it because it is an investment in eternal treasures. Anytime I think about this, I can't help but think about the end of the movie Schindler's List. I hope I'm not spoiling it for you if you haven't seen it, but it has been, I think, over 20 years, so fair enough. I'm going to spoil it for you. At the end of the movie, when the war is finally coming to an end, a lot of the Jewish people that Schindler was used to save from the Holocaust and from the concentration camps decided that they would show their gratitude for his funding of their lives by putting together a little ring. They got basically the gold from their teeth and whatever jewelry they could find, and they melted it down, and they made him a ring. And on the ring, it says, "Whoever saves one life saves them all." And Schindler, upon seeing this gift that he knew it took these Jewish prisoners so much hard work and effort to make, immediately broke down in tears. As a fairly wealthy man himself, or a man who had had some wealth anyway at one time, he begins looking around at the various possessions he has and at the people surrounding him that have just made this gift for him, and he begins crying. And he looks at his car and he says, I could have gotten 5 more if I just sold my car. And then he looks at another possession of his and he says, I could have gotten 1 more. I could have gotten 1 more if I just sold this, or if I had just given that. And on he goes, looking at the things that he had taken for granted in his life that ended up calculating in the lives of people being saved. And it's a powerful moment because I think sometimes we can divorce in our minds the significance of money from actual salvation of people. And indeed, that is the reality. Like, money will be used by God to fund the mission so that people will actually be saved. Now, obviously, we're not Oscar Schindlers, and I don't even know that part in the story is real or true. It's probably made up for dramatic effect. But whatever the case may be, the point still stands, is that in the final analysis, the treasures we have here are able to be and are often used by God in order to fund the mission to reach those who are lost. And why is that the case? Because that's the way God operates in his world. We're told that Jesus Christ, when he became poor that we might become rich. He had nowhere to lay his head so that you would have an eternal home to lay your head. And so Paul, first of all, says, in order to reach some, in order to win some, I'm willing to forego my salary. I'm willing to give sacrificially of my finances. But then he also notes that there may be, and indeed often will be, a sacrifice of family for the sake of reaching the lost as well. He continues in verse 5 of 1 Corinthians 9, "Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas?" What Paul is talking about here is the fact that Peter and others that are apostles had wives, and in fact, many of their wives actually went with them on their journeys to preach the gospel to other places. And that's good, and that's great, and that's just fine. But what he'll also go on to point out in verse 12 is that he, again, did not take advantage of this right. He says in verse 12, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. If you go back to chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, which we went over a few weeks ago, you're going to note that Paul basically advocates for some degree of celibacy because it frees him up to preach the gospel unencumbered without the responsibilities of family. Now, again, I want to emphasize this is not something that people are obligated to do by any stretch of the imagination, and it's just fine, good, right, and salutary for one to minister and have a family. Nevertheless, I think the point of application for us, even if we're not going to go as far as the Apostle Paul has, is we must recognize that inevitably time with family will be sacrificed for the sake of the mission. Time that we could be doing other things with our family may be taken up by offering our home to somebody that needs to see us, or may need us to counsel them, or may need to talk through an issue. And inevitably, even in those sort of smaller ways, that means that time away from family will be had for the sake of the mission to reach lost people. That's what the Apostle Paul did. I came across a story a little while back about a man in the Twin Cities in Minnesota named Alan Law, affectionately known as the Sandwich Man, who spends 365 days a year feeding the local homeless community sandwiches, going out, really spending all of his day preparing the sandwiches, and then going out at night, in the middle of the night, and handing out the sandwiches. And he's done this because he's motivated by the love that God has had for him and the salvation that God has given him, and therefore he wants to do something tangible to serve his neighbors. Now, again, I am not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that we are all obligated to do the same kind of thing, but it is just to note that in order to reach people outside of the faith, we need to recognize that there will be a cost on that level as well, that there can be a cost when it comes to our time, and our time can be easily divided that way. The Apostle Paul is honest about that and shares that. And then the last thing, and maybe most significant in this passage, is not only may there be a sacrifice of finances or a sacrifice of our family time, but also there's going to be inevitably sacrifice of our preferences in order to reach the lost. Here's what the Apostle Paul says he did in verse 19 of chapter 9. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews, in order to I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." And of course, Paul doesn't mean that he will save them, but you get his point. "I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." Yes, more than anything that historically sort of undergirds thinking about how we approach those outside of the faith, it's this mentality, that we would be willing to sacrifice what we might naturally want to do or might naturally choose to do for the sake of winning those around us. That's what the Apostle Paul delineates here. To the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those under the law, I became like those under the law. To those outside the law, he's talking about Gentiles here, I became as one outside the law. The point is, he wants you to know that he's willing to adapt. He's willing to sort of adapt to the audience that he's speaking to the person he's speaking to, in order that they might hear the gospel. Indeed, if you think about missionary efforts to China back in the day about 100 years ago or so, you're going to see European and American missionaries going there pictured in the garb of the local communities they serve. Indeed, that kind of thing still happens all the time today. And the reason that kind of thing happens is really based on words like the Apostle Paul's here. In case you were wondering if we have an example of where we see Paul doing this, you don't have to look any further than going to Acts chapter 17, verses 22 through 34, where Paul is preaching to a group of people that are interested in the latest philosophies and fashions, and in order to reach them, he preaches an entirely different sermon than he does any other time in the book of Acts when he's speaking typically in synagogues to Jewish people. There, in this sermon, he mentions their own gods and their own poets and their own cultural customs. In order to win some, Paul willfully went out of his way to learn about his neighbor that he might effectively share the gospel with them. Yes, indeed, this is the practice known in sort of missiology circles as contextualization. And some people get very afraid of that word because, of course, it can be abused and there can be such a thing as over-contextualization. But there has to be some contextualization, and every missionary who's ever gone overseas has known this because they've spent a long time learning the language and the customs and the cultural practices of wherever they're going in order to be as effective as possible. So too, that is the reality for anybody seeking to reach those outside of the church. One of the best examples I've seen of this in modern-day mission work in the United States is an author that goes by the name of Preston Sprinkle. He has done a phenomenal job of doing outreach to the LGBTQ unbelieving community. He has a book on this called People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue, and his stance and his posture in addressing people that are that make up this community, and especially those who might be activists in this community, has been really, really effective in getting him a hearing so that he might be able to share the gospel. And Paul's grand point in all this is that it's worth the sacrifices. It really is. He says in verse 24, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air." This is, again, in reference to how he approaches his neighbors. He says, I try to be very focused about how I go about reaching them. He continues, verse 27, "But I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Paul's motive in going about preaching the gospel of Christ crucified for the forgiveness of sins in various ways, in various languages, according to various customs, is so that everyone, as many as possible, might be saved. Charles Spurgeon was a man that was known for his evangelistic fervor, and I've always appreciated this quote, if for anything, because it shows this same kind of fervor. He says, "Oh, my brothers and sisters in Christ, if sinners will be damned, at least let them leap to hell over our bodies. And if they will perish, let them perish with our arms about their knees, imploring them to stay and not merely to destroy themselves. If hell must be filled, at least let it be filled in the teeth of our exertions, and let not one go there unarmed and unwarned and unprayed for." Indeed, that reflects, I think, the mentality of the Apostle Paul as he thinks about reaching those outside of the church. And yet, here's the reality. As we look at the various sacrifices that Paul delineates are part of his mission, we have to be honest and recognize that no matter who we are, we don't get anywhere close to what Jesus does in order to fulfill his mission to seek and save the lost. No, the fact is we need to remember that Jesus fulfilled the mission first because we have not and we cannot. We're not the ones who are busy doing the saving. We're just the ones who cast out the seed and maybe do some watering, but ultimately it's he who brings the growth because Jesus fulfills the mission perfectly on our behalf to save us when we inevitably fail at the mission. And so we need to recognize as we wrap up today that there is much grace for failures in the mission. We need to remember that Jesus found your soul so valuable that he lived, died, and rose again to save you. And he did it because he knew that you'd be tempted toward caring more about your money than others. As he willfully went without money in your place, he did it because he knew that your family would mean more to you than the salvation of others. So if he willfully went without a family for you, he did it because he knew that you would struggle to get past your own preferences for the sake of others. So he left the comforts of heaven for you in order that he might win you. I want to let you know that even your coldness toward your neighbor in the past is forgiven because of Christ. His love for you and his salvation of you does not and will not change because of your failure to become all things to all people. He's already done that for you. You are forgiven of your distractions and your lack of care and your pride and your despair and your fear of rejection that so often hinders us from going out in mission to the world. No, the reality is you need to be reminded that you're not seen by those things. You are hidden in the righteousness of Christ due to the baptism that he has taken you into. So now, in light of that reality, let's seek to share that same message with others, that there is a God who forgives them and desires to have them as his own so that they might be saved for eternity as well. All right, folks, that is our Law and Gospel devotion today. I hope that's been an encouragement to you, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.